Okay, welcome to Fostering Mentalization and the Treatment of Borderline Personality Disorder. I'm George Grant, as you can see from my name on the little shrunken video. So let's begin. Oops, just have to do this. Here we go. Gonna shove that back down there, and we're set to go. Okay. So, borderline personality disorder is a complex and serious disorder with a pervasive pattern of difficulties, including emotional regulation, impulse control, and instability both in relationships and in self-image. Mentalization is really what happens when you're not borderline. That is to say, it's the process by which we make sense of each other and ourselves implicitly and explicitly in terms of subjective states and mental processes. And developmentally, what happens is that when there's a failure to achieve object constancy, that is that we can, as Margaret Mahler outlined in her 1975 book, the psychological birth of the human child, it includes three aspects. One is the capacity to recognize and tolerate both loving and hostile feelings toward the same object. You might notice with some borderline clients that one day you're the greatest therapist who's ever lived, and the very next day you're the devil himself. And this is quite common. They really can't conceive of you as more than a part object, really. So they have very fragmented ideas of who you are. Second is the capacity to keep feelings centered on a specific object. You may hear about a whole litany of people they may be talking about in the session, and sometimes you don't know if that's the same person or if it's different people or if it's a conglomeration of people. It's sometimes very hard to keep track of. And last, the capacity to value an object for attributes other than the function of satisfying needs. So an example here is I once had a borderline patient tell me, I pay you to fix me. So there was no thought of, I enjoy coming to sessions, or I enjoy our talks, or coming here and being able to say everything. Really no thought of that. It was sort of this very concrete transaction. Nothing like we would regard as real human contact. And even though, it's a developmental deficiency in object constancy, the flavor of that deficiency is actually colored by what sort of attachment style the person with borderline has. If they have an ambivalent style, well, it's going to be your very typical borderline person who can be confrontational. They can be hostile. They can say all sorts of awful things. And, the next time you see them, it's sort of they forgot what they said, or they don't recall having had the confrontation. So an ambivalent attachment is what we think of. And usually an ambivalent attachment can be the result of an intrusive mother, or at least a child that felt that the mother was intrusive. But that's not the only way that somebody can be borderline. There could be an avoidant attachment. This is the person who has all those deficiencies of object constancy, but tends to give one-word answers, tends to, tends to be avoidant. May not show up to sessions for quite a while. May not say anything, may have trouble talking, really kind of disappears into the woodwork. And, this is the borderline personality that a lot of people don't consider borderline because it's not the stereotypical borderline who tends to act out, challenges boundaries, and does all those things that are more typical. And the disordered attachment, well, this is a little bit of each. If the hyperactivating strategies of the ambivalent attachment stops working, they'll go to the avoidant attachment. They'll stop talking, or vice versa. So these can be the real crazy making folks. You're not sure what you're going to get any particular day. So as a result of hypersensitivity of the attachment process, patients with borderline are vulnerable to losses of mentalization in the context of attachment relationships. They sort of forget who they are, forget who you are, and really have a difficult time with relationships. So loss of mentalization leads to pre-mentalistic modes of functioning. They can be very concrete. They can dissociate. They can think it doesn't really happen unless it's acted upon. Unless some action occurs, and of course we only talk in the room, so that can be a real basis for boundary violations, or what we would say in psychoanalysis, violations of the frame. In these states of mind, experiences are either too real or meaningless, and the patient's understanding of motives is solely in terms of the physical world. So things have to happen or be done to be meaningful. So these distortions of subjectivity are commonly accompanied by intense psychic pain that is hard for those not sharing the patient's experience to fully appreciate. So it's very difficult for them because they don't have this theory of mind that many of the rest of us have, and they don't really have the ability to defend against strong feelings, or even know what to do next. So what does a therapist do with these individuals? Well, the structure of the treatment, it needs to be well structured. It needs to have a frame. So they need a container. They need firm boundaries. When should they show up? Is there something they have to do in the therapy? For example, lie on the couch, or something else they should be complying with. They should leave on time, pay on time, and do everything they need to do to hold the frame, right? Devote considerable effort to enhancing compliance. Okay, so as soon as you agree on a contract, you agree on a fee, a time, a day, you'll notice they'll start attempting to move that around. So you have to be very wary of this. Of course, if there's an occasional emergency that occurs, my car broke down, I have to, do you have any time later in the week? Well, that's a possibility. If something like this starts happening every week, it's time to explore that. Have a clear focus. Is there something we should be working on in here, right? So have a clear focus. Have in mind what they would like to work on. Be theoretically highly coherent to both therapist and patient, sometimes deliberately omitting information incompatible with the theory. Mentalization is very abstract. So if they're asking about what it is you're doing, and if they're paranoid, they may be very short and simple. Explain the least amount that you can. Because if you get into all the theoretical aspects of this, it's they're going to get very confused. And if you explain too much, if they started out paranoid, they're really, they might actually get a little more paranoid after a very theoretical and high-flying explanation. Be relatively long-term. Okay, so you want to work on significant things. Working on, I don't know, I would like to, I can't think of something particularly short term because I don't really do that much, but try to pick things that are relatively long term and that have multiple facets to them, so you can kind of work on that over time. Encourage a powerful attachment relationship between you and the patient, enabling the therapist to adopt a relatively active rather than a passive stance, because through the interaction, you're going to be modeling mentalization for them and really with them, okay? And be integrated with other services available to the patient. If you're part of a medical group, you're part of an agency or whatever, and they have individual treatment, they have group, they have other stuff going on. Enforce boundaries and the frame in that too. So if group is always this day at this time, their individual is this day at this time. I don't know, life skills is always this day at the, be very, very coherent with the entire treatment. The therapist stance is actually very common sense. You approach it with a sense of humility deriving from a sense of not knowing. Why? Well, we don't really know. Secondly, it's going to feel less attacking, particularly if you're interacting with them a lot. If you come off curious, maybe a little confused, and you really need their help so that this can be clarified. Thirdly, not knowing is at the very crux of mentalization, right? Checking how we're feeling, checking how we think the other person is feeling, right? Checking our environment. Because we're not, why do we check? Well, because we're not sure, right? So that not knowing stance is sort of the crux of that process that we're modeling for them, right? Patience and taking time to identify differences in perspective. Well, could both people be wrong here? Could both people be right? Does anyone ever win an argument? Okay, so all these things that goes beyond the simple binary of, I had an argument, I won, they lost, right? Because that's very much the mindset in the borderline world. There, you want to introduce maybe the idea that there's other possibilities. Legitimizing and accepting different perspectives. Could there be multiple right answers? Is it hard to know what the answer is? It's unclear, right? Actively questioning the patient about their experience, asking for detailed descriptions of experience. And here you want to ask what questions, right? What was that like? What were the circumstances? You want to avoid questions like, why did you do that? Right? Because it not only sounds accusatory, but you sort of force them to come up with a whole scenario to defend their position, and it sort of takes you out of the room, down the street, and around the corner. So keep it concrete, because that's where they're at, right? So what questions, not why questions. Careful eschewing of the need to supply understandings for things that do not make immediate sense. The therapist is instructed to say explicitly that something is unclear. It's unclear. It's hard to know. It's uncertain. I'm not sure, right? So not knowing is actually at the very center of this experience of mentalization. And it's why we check ourselves, we check our environment to see if what we think is true is really true, to see if the subjective aligns with the objective. So the therapist's attitude, I'm going to read a portion of this. The therapist's task is to stimulate the mentalizing process and make it an essential feature of the therapeutic interaction. Thinking about oneself and others develops in part through a process of identification. The therapist's ability to use his mind and to demonstrate a change of mind when presented with alternative views is internalized by the patient. Gradually, the patient becomes more curious about his own and others' minds and is consequently better able to reappraise himself and his understandings of others. So you, as a therapist, are modeling the process of mentalization. And eventually, the client will identify with that and start doing it, him or herself. Okay? What you're doing when interacting with the client, you're modeling that mentalization process. And in fact, you're kind of mentalizing out loud. Okay? You're kind of talking about this process of uncertainty and determination that goes on in your head for the client. Anybody know this guy? Okay? So he, was probably working right around a lot of borderline people. It's Peter Falk's Columbo. And if you've ever seen the old TV series, he was always unsure. Oh, just one more thing, ma'am. He was always asking about, just one more thing he wasn't sure about. And it was actually kind of a good way to interact with these people who were potential murderers, in addition to getting some good information. So the not knowing stance, the not knowing aspect of the mentalizing stance is part of this general therapeutic attitude and is central to ensuring that the therapist maintains his curiosity about his patient's mental states. He must accept that both he and his patient experience things only impressionistically and that neither of them has primacy of knowledge about the other or about what occurs between them. Okay, so it's this process of, not knowing, curiosity, asking questions to finding out maybe a little bit, and then becoming curious about what that means. Okay, so it's kind of this never-ending process, this never-ending negotiation that goes on between two people. So the basic interventions before we go to a few excerpts from a case session. Demonstrating empathy with the patient's current subjective state, right? So it's a very painful condition. And at times you might have the feeling that you'd like to act out, but it's it's something that is really sort of happening to them. It's they're in a world they don't understand, and even though we can feel it can be very difficult to be with these individuals, we have to regard them with empathy. Exploration, clarification, if appropriate, challenge. So in the process of being curious and questioning and things of this nature, we keep exploring, right? We question, we explore, and we're curious. Identifying affect and establishing an affect focus. So we want to ask about the feeling states because this is most likely the thing that causes them to lose mentalization, and fall back into primitive coping mechanism reminiscent of some maladaptive attachment style. And last but not least, mentalizing the relationship. For those of you psychoanalytically inclined, relationship here can be interpreted as transference. So you could say things, ask if the thing they're objecting to with another person. You can maybe inquire after they've been in treatment for a little while, well, does that happen here? Do I do that? Or has there ever been feelings about me like that? It's good to have some knowledge that they see you in the room as a separate entity, if only like a twin. Maybe before you start introducing yourself that abjectly, but you can certainly do it, right? So those four things would be the basic interventions. Let's go look at some examples. This one, I apologize for the small writing, but I'll read it too. A 26-year-old unemployed woman living in social housing was referred to our service because of persistent suicide attempts, self-harm, poor social function, and chaotic personal relationships. She had 2 children who were in care of social services, and she stated that she wanted them back. At interview, she was sullen, sat hunched forward throughout with a baseball cap pulled low so that her face was covered. Okay, so this is likely somebody who's borderline with an avoidant attachment. We see that she's sort of trying to avoid the person who's interviewing her at the intake. She gave an account of having been an unwanted child of a drug-addicted father and a mother who had multiple partners. She had been abused by one of her mother's boyfriends. Her education was rudimentary, but she had learned to read and write. At initial psychiatric assessment, she was considered to be of average intelligence. One constant figure in her life was her maternal grandmother, who brought her up from the age of 5 to 16 years. She then moved in with a man older than her and became pregnant 6 months later with her first child. Her second child was conceived during a drug binge with acquaintances and the father was not known. Okay. So let's see what some of the process looks like in the session. I won't do the whole thing from the article. By the way, I'll post the article down below the video just for reference, unless YouTube gets me for copyright violation or something like that, in which case I'll have to take it down. But this is taken from the article by Fonagy and Bateman from 2013 in Psychoanalytic Inquiry. So at the beginning of the session, patient says, "I have nothing to say today, I'm blank." Therapist, "What's it like to be in a session sitting with me but having nothing to say and nothing in your mind?" Uncomfortable. I can see that. I suppose that there's a bit of pressure to say something to reduce how uncomfortable you feel. I have to talk, otherwise it will be worse with you looking at me. Is there anything particular about today that's making it problematic, or is there anything I can do to help this? So, again, the therapist, very curious, focusing in on the feelings, and is generally exploring and asking about and being curious about the person's emotional state. So the patient goes on to say, "I feel uncomfortable about things at the moment and do not want to go to the group anymore." So by being curious, we're finding out it's something to do with her group and not this individual treatment. "I find Jenny, another patient, impossible. She talks all the time and the therapist does not ask her to keep quiet. At the last group, I walked out because she did not stop talking, so it was a waste of time, me being there. No one else had a chance. Can you say what it was that you were feeling at this time?" The therapist and the group should be doing something to help us and should take charge. Okay, so we can kind of see here that the patient is feeling that some sort of action should be taken. Very concrete terms. She goes on to say, "I felt useless as I can't do anything." He gets involved with Jenny and ignores us. "I felt useless and I can't do anything." Okay, so there's that's probably how this person actually feels a lot of the time. Therapist responds, "Sounds like we have to think about how to get the therapist to do something." So how could we model maybe a situation where here the patient could say to this group therapist, "I'd like to talk," or should she just butt in when, Jenny is prattling on about something? Should she just start talking maybe? Okay, then she goes on to say, "I'm not going to the group anymore." Oh, well, that solves that problem. Therapist, before we get there, I think we should discuss what this therapist is up to. So I think the patient's individual therapist here maybe has some idea that the patient has some transference to this group therapist that's not particularly good and is activating her abandoning or avoidant attachment. So next he would go and explore that. So I'm not going to go through the whole thing, but just keep in mind that the whole process of mentalization-based treatment starts with curiosity, and we use that to help the patient explore feeling states in a meaningful way, and we do it in such a way that we actually model the process of mentalization for them until they can identify with it and make it their own. Okay, so I hope that helped, and I'm going to post that, and hopefully I'll get lots of responses below, or not. I don't know. Okay, stay tuned for the next video.